Ambassador Christopher Hill talking to us. Well, let's get to our panel right now. Joining us in the studio is Kim-Renaud. She's a professor emeritus and a senior advisor for the Institute of Korean Studies at George Washington University. Also with us is Zhang. He's the chief correspondent for Shanghai Wen Hui Daily here in Washington, D.C. From our newsroom, Becker is an analyst and commentator on U.S. DPRK Relations and has traveled to the DPRK numerous times. And Jonah Blank is a senior political scientist with the RAND Corporation. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Let's go to the newsroom and start with Brian. Brian, the latest we're hearing is that the U.S. is insisting that the DPRK take what's described as, and quoting here, concrete steps towards denuclearizing before Trump meets Kim. What does that mean? Is that a precondition that the U.S. is now setting for these talks?
Well, it would appear so. The Trump administration and Trump himself is under great pressure. Many in the media in Washington and in New York and in the foreign policy establishment have treated this announcement that Trump would accept the invitation and go meet with Kim Jong Un as if the sky was falling, something terrible was about to happen. So it sounds like Trump is hedging a little bit. But when he says the DPRK has to do something concrete, well, the DPRK has done something concrete. The DPRK has pledged that they will not go forward with other missile technology tests or nuclear tests in the run-up to the meeting. That's something very concrete. That's something very specific. In other words, they've assumed the position of the freeze. Now they're waiting for a freeze on the part of the United States. Now, the other part of the equation would have been a freeze of U.S.-South Korean military exercises. That's going to go forward, and the DPRK is not insisting right now that those drills, those war exercises, not take place. So we've already seen concrete steps by the DPRK. The question is Trump retreating now from his position, or does he just have to say what he has to say in order to go forward? It's really about will and desire. Every time the U.S. has sat down with the DPRK for real negotiations, there's been a freeze in its nuclear program. That's been true for the last 20 years. And each time the U.S. goes back to a bellicose position, that freeze comes off and the North Koreans go forward with their nuclear weapons test. This is a moment for America. This is a moment for the Trump administration to make the right decision to go forward with the meeting and to negotiate in good faith.
Jonah, what is your view on what is happening right now? If this is is this a precondition, or is it some kind of negotiating tactic? Perhaps a bit of posturing by the United States before it gets into talks?
I think that there is some confusion within the administration about their way forward. This is an announcement that came from the president with essentially no input from the Secretary of State, from the National Security Advisor, as far as we can tell, from the other key decision makers. So when the president's spokeswoman said there would have to be preconditions, that was wheeled back very quickly. And the White House then said, no, this is going to go forward regardless. I think that part of the confusion is that for the past quarter century, every leader of North Korea has very much desperately wanted a summit meeting with the U.S. president. And all prior presidents have said no. That will be at most the capstone of a negotiation. This is the first time a U.S. president has said, I will grant this enormous concession without anything really meaningful coming back in the other direction.
Yang, these proposed talks were driven in part by South Korea. What is South Korea hoping would happen here?
Well, actually, there was a saying, kind of Konglish, Korea passing. They felt they were kind of cut out of the negotiation and felt it is really their affair. So they are, I guess, President Moon's initiative partly has to do with having some agency in their own destiny. And it's not true that everybody is enthusiastic about it. There are lots of people who are very critical. They think President Moon is really a pro-communist. But I can see how President Moon, like many Koreans, felt a kind of sense of urgency, crisis, because of the very frank and undiplomatic going and coming forth. And
right. Is the South Korean position that the peninsula has to be free of all nuclear weapons?
I think of course, they would be very, very happy if there is no nuclear threat. And if they are free from any kind of war, because they have experienced real war. It's not just an idea. So for the first time, Koreans for the longest time, they felt they were really not worried about another war because they enjoyed peace for a long time. And then suddenly, the recent exchange of the two heads of the states made them feel for the first time really something might happen. And so at worst, this initiative actually, I think, buys time. People are hopeful.
Right. Okay. Song, the Chinese, of course, looking at this very closely. China has a vested interest. It borders the DPRK as well. There was a telephone call from President Xi Jinping to President Trump saying he supports this initiative. What is China hoping will happen?
I think China has a million reasons to hope this kind of dialogue will finally be successful. And as we have seen before, China is a very crucial part of this process, but we do not have the keys. From one angle, North Korea in the last long time, they refuse to talk about denuclearization, especially this Kim Jong Un's government. From another angle, I think U.S. government has been holding their demand to be very firm so that we don't see the possibility of direct dialogue, especially between presidents of these two countries. Now, Mr. Trump made this decision. Whether it will be controversial or not, that is another thing. But China, I think, will be hopeful, will be willing to see a big access in the coming few months.
Brian, when we talked with Ambassador Hill just a few minutes ago in that interview that we did there, we talked about the possibility of the DPRK giving up its nuclear weapons completely. I mean, do you see that happening?
I have to say that the DPRK has been very quite clear about why they developed and acquired nuclear weapons and long-range missile technology. They said it was in response to the hostile policy that's been pursued for many, many years by the United States. In other words, it was responsive. In July 2016, the North Korean leadership, again under Kim Jong Un, outlined a 5-point program for the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. That included demands on the United States, not simply demands on the DPRK. Those demands included a full audit from the United States, which was the entity that introduced nuclear weapons into the Korean Peninsula. It did so starting in 1958 and retained those nuclear weapons formally until 1991. And it also insisted on getting from the United States a guarantee that the United States would not use first-strike nuclear weapons against the DPRK. And as I think all of us who have been paying attention know, that the Nuclear Posture Review adopted in 2002 under George W. Bush identified North Korea as a possible country where the United States would use first-strike weapons in a first-strike attack. As a consequence, the DPRK then left the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is its legal right, because it felt its national security was threatened, and they began building nuclear weapons. That's when everything froze. Now, if we want to go back, what the U.S. needs to do is give those guarantees to the DPRK, including an audit of nuclear weapons and a promise that the U.S. will not introduce or use nuclear weapons, and at the same time sign a peace treaty and begin normalizing relations. Right. That can happen.
Brian, I just want to get some clarity on an issue here, and that is the legality of what the DPRK is doing. Because when I talked to Ambassador Hill and I said, if the DPRK gives up its nuclear weapons, that will be seen as a major concession. What could they expect in return from the United States? He said it's not a concession because what they're doing is illegal. Is it illegal?
No, it's not illegal. And Professor Hill is playing with words here. I have to strongly disagree with him, in fact. The U.S. was able to pressure the Security Council to go along with resolutions condemning the DPRK nuclear program. But the DPRK, again, left the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is the right of all signers to the NPT, when it feels its national security is under attack. Why did it do so? It's because George W. Bush adopted a new aggressive bellicose nuclear posture that identified North Korea as eligible for a first strike attack. North Korea is not illegal here. What needs to happen, we need to go beyond the resolutions right now and recognize that what the North Koreans want is a security guarantee that they won't be subjected to, quote, total annihilation, as Donald Trump threatened from the podium of the UN General Assembly, and which the North Koreans actually endured between 1950 and 53.
Jonah, do you see that happening? Do you see North Korea, the DPRK, giving up its nuclear weapons in return for a solid nuclear security agreement from the United States?
No,
guarantee?
No, absolutely not. I think that there are no circumstances under which Kim Jong Un would be willing to give up his nuclear capability. He sees it as an existential guarantee of his regime's survival, and he's not necessarily wrong about that. He saw what happened to Saddam Hussein, he saw what happened to Muammar Gaddafi, and he is quite intent on not joining that crew. I think we have to separate out a couple of issues. One is, would Kim Jong-un agree to denuclearization? And the second is, would he actually denuclearize? But he has
said as much to South Korea, hasn't he?
As I understand it, he said he is willing to discuss denuclearization. Okay. That's a very different thing. I think some of what Mr. Becker said I agree with, some of it I do not agree with. But one of the things that he quite rightly pointed out is that North Korea has, for a long time, said it would be willing to denuclearize under certain conditions. The problem is, those conditions are ones that the United States and indeed South Korea and to a degree Japan are unlikely to meet. Even beyond that, there's the issue that the Kim regime, Kim Jong-un's father, broke the agreed upon framework in the 1990s and cheated on that agreed framework. We have no real reason, I think, to accept that any agreement is not going to be played with at the very least.
I would say that it was the United States that really violated the 1994 General Framework Agreement. I mean, there was not a shovel into the dirt for the light water reactor that was promised in the 1994 agreement. It was only William Perry's intervention in 1998 that got things back on track. There's been a lot of demonizing of the DPRK. It's fine to have a critique of the regime, but at least let's be factually straightforward about what really happened to the framework agreement.
Well,
go ahead.
Shelley, the agreed framework was indeed played with by both sides. However, if we're talking about is the Kim regime willing to give up its nuclear capability, we have to look at the fact that the agreed framework was dealing basically with plutonium, and the uranium route was something that the Kim regime embarked upon in violation of, at a very bare minimum, the spirit and some would argue the text of the agreed statement. Going beyond that, however, I think a point that Mr. Becker makes that I agree with, and that is important, is that the U.S. and North Korea were on what I see as a very promising path in the 1990s. Despite neither side fully living up to the agreement, they were much closer in 1999 than they are right now. And when President Bush came in and put North Korea in the axis of evil, that really set back the possibility of a peaceful resolution.
Yang-Ki, would South Korea support and push very hard for a nuclear-free peninsula in return for solid security guarantees to the North that it will not be attacked?
Of course, I'm not a spokesman for South Korea, but personally, I would think so. I think if it is declared a nuclear-free zone, there will be certainly less tension, and then it will be possible for people to talk about peace rather than just talking about who's stronger. And I think that alone actually helps North Korea, because they are now, recognized as a nuclear state, which they, I'm sure, wanted, because the reason why Kim Jong Un is inviting our president to table is he feels kind of now he's equal.
So is the feeling on the DPRK side that they're negotiating from, or will get into negotiations from a position of strength?
I think that's how they feel. By keeping their nuclear program, they feel they are kind of feared. They are recognized as a strong state. Because without that, they really have not much.
Song, let's listen to what the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi had to say about prospects for an agreement. Let's watch this.
During the Winter Games, the DPRK did not conduct any nuclear tests, and the United States and ROK suspended their joint exercises targeting the DPRK. This proves that China's proposal of suspension for suspension was a right prescription for the problem and created basic conditions for the improvement of inter-Korean relations.
So, Song, firstly, explain that to us. Suspension for suspension. What is that formula? What does that mean?
That means North Korea have to suspend its nuclear and ICBM tests, and at the same time, America and South Korea need to suspend their joint military exercises.
Does that, in your view, form a good basis for negotiations going on?
I see that is very much true, and we are already seeing this is happening in the last couple of 3 months. And North Korea didn't test any ICBM and nuke, and also America has agreed to suspend its joint military exercises with South Korea, at least during the first couple of months. That's a good start.
Brian, what is your view on this double suspension? Because one of the questions that was raised by the person that you mentioned not a moment ago, which was the former Defense Secretary William Perry, he says, what happens during the negotiations? Do countries like the United States and its allies continue to put pressure on the DPRK while these talks are taking place, or will it be this double suspension which is in effect?
Yeah, I think the U.S. government, and I think Trump, no matter what Trump personally wants to do, will be under extreme pressure to maintain the regime of maximum pressure. I mean, let's look at also the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran arms deal. I mean, even after Iran is fully in compliance with the IAEA and has no nuclear weapons whatsoever, the government in Washington keeps and has kept imposing other economic sanctions on the DPRK because of this fundamental animus against the government. Not because the Iran and the U.S. can't live in peace, because the U.S. doesn't want to. And that's the thing with North Korea, too. The U.S. can make this deal. They can have an arrangement with the DPRK where start with the freeze for freeze, suspension for suspension as the foundation for going forward. That could happen, but it requires will and desire. Does the U.S. actually want peace to break out in the Korean Peninsula? I think the world does. I think the Koreans do. But it seems like America fears that.
Jonah, the two sides seem really far apart right now, don't they?
If you take their maximalist positions, yes. What Mr. Trump has said is that he is under the impression that these are negotiations leading to denuclearization. And that just, at least in my analysis, is not going to happen. However, a suspense for suspense, that actually is more realistic, and that still is not the U.S. position. Because that would not be a return to the status quo. Right now, that would be setting back the alliance between the U.S. and South Korea immeasurably. Now, does that mean it's impossible? Not necessarily. Does that mean that that is where the negotiations will end up? I don't think so at all, because I think that ultimately there are a lot of steps between suspending exercises and simply scaling them to a level that perhaps the DPRK sees as less threatening.
Youngie, where's the compromise here? Where is the common ground between these two, well, let's say in this case, between the United States and the DPRK?
Maybe we shouldn't really expect an immediate result from this talk, but I think just like a Nixon-Mao meeting, it's a beginning maybe of something very surprising, unexpected, and this is something you can expect from unpredictable people. And sometimes wars and peace come from chance things. And it's much better than doing nothing, right? So
I would hope a kind of limited or partial agreement can be achieved, as other panelists are saying. At least you can suspend North Korea from doing more tests, and as a reward, you can at least scale down to some extent the joint military exercises and have some financial assistance to North Korea and some other ways you can reward them. I think that can be a very good start of a long journey.
But of course, Song, they'd also have to take into consideration other powers in the region, like Japan, for instance.
I think Japan will oppose any kind of military action against North Korea. Even they are supporting a lot of economic sanctions against North Korea together with America. But I think their interest is also to see the peace in the peninsula.
Okay, yes, very quickly.
Yes. One thing I think that all of us are in agreement with, and that there's consensus in Washington, is that negotiations are better than warmongering.
Right.
And nobody that I'm aware of sees a possibility of war between the U.S. and North Korea as anything other than a disaster.
That's where we're going to have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arun Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.